Okay, so I'm going to make a pattern. I'm going to have no percussion. I'm going to have the Shakes and Hats playing pattern 1 for their layer, and I'm going to have the kick only active in the bass layer playing pattern 1 for the bass layer. Okay. Now on the details page I'm going to set all the drums, whether or not they're active, to full complexity range. Okay, like that. And that means that, and I'll turn the phrase variation off. Now every single drum is at full complexity range. If I move the complexity ball for the pattern, see the little dots moving in the sliders? With all the drums set to full complexity range, wherever I set the complexity of the pattern, that is the complexity of all the drums that are playing. So if I push the pattern up to fully complexed, look at the little dots, they're allowed to go right to the top level of complexity to match the complexity of the ball. So right up at the top now, every active drum is playing fully complexed. Every drum is playing the most notes it can play in the pattern for its layer. If I bring the complexity of the pattern down, because no drum is being restricted in its range, the little dots are allowed to follow the complexity ball of the pattern all the way down to the absolute minimum complexity. Now every active drum is playing the absolute minimum notes it can play in the pattern for its layer. Okay, and anything in between. Fully complexed, about 80% complexed, 75%, 50%, 25%, 20%, and fully simple. Okay, but the complexity range sliders allows us to restrict any drum to a particular complexity range. So I put the ball up to full complexity. None of the drums are restricted. Every drum is playing the absolute maximum notes it can play in its pattern selected for its layer. But now I'll restrict the kick right down to its minimum complexity. The kick cannot go above its minimum complexity. So I've got a very fully complex Shaker and Hats with the kick playing its absolute minimum complexity. Yeah, or I'll bring the ball down to about 25% complexity or 20% complexity, like that. Shakes and Hats unrestricted, they're allowed to follow the ball down. Look, the little dots are exactly where the ball is, at about 20% complexity, and I'll now ram the kick right up to its maximum complexity, restricted at that range, at that upper range. So the kick is forced to stick up here, playing its maximum complexity, the maximum amount of notes it can play in the pattern for its layer. Shakes and Hats are playing about 20% complexity. Yeah, fully complex kick with quite simple Shaker and Hats. Or I could stick the kick at about 50% complexity, that real narrow range like that, right in the middle where it's doing a 4 on the floor. Bring the overall complexity of the pattern up to about 75%. Shakes and Hats unrestricted are allowed to go to that exact amount, 75%. So they're playing 75%. The kick is stuck at 50% complexity. And now I could bring the hats down to about, look where the little dot is, at about 40% complexity or 35%. A little bit less. Bit less. Yeah? And now I've got Shakers playing about 75% complexity where the dot is to match the ball because it's unrestricted. But the Hats being restricted down to about 25% complexity, the kick's stuck at 50% complexity doing a 4 on the floor. A completely different beat. Yeah? So you've got this wonderful ability to restrict the complexity of any drum to any amount you want, giving you this vast variety of beats you can get. Yeah? Out of the possible drums active in a layer and the possible patterns those layers can be playing. Right. Now further, we've got this phrase variation, and this introduces variations on the phrasing, on the pattern of any active drum at whatever level of complexity it's playing at. Okay, so let's look at that next.